With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yoma Daf Ayin Tes. Chevra, we are going into the final stretch, the 10th to the last daf of the Masechta. We're going to start off on Daf Ayin Ches Amud Beis, referring back to the Mishnah in the beginning of the Perek, that both Hamelech and the Kala are allowed Yirchatzu es Paneim. We'll see as to why. We're going to speak about the shiur for eating. The shiur that brings about a punishment of kares for eating is the koiseves hagasa shiur, the large date shiur, and not the normal kizaya shiur. And as the Gemara tells us that kim luhu l'rabanan, that a person only feels relieved, a person's mind is put to ease, miyasfa data, when you have that amount. If a person is fasting and they only eat a kazayas, they're still in a state of affliction. And we're going to have basically a very interesting and maybe even unusual machloikas between Amirayim as to what is the shiur of this date. Is it larger than the egg? And so holds either Rava or Rabba in the name of the Amoira Rav Yehuda versus Rab Zavid, that holds that the shiur of Keseva Sagasa is smaller than the egg. Here clearly we see that it's not that we just simply use empirical science or empirical proof by picking up a date and picking up an egg and comparing them, but we want to understand when Chazal referred to the large date. I'm sure there are many sizes of dates and there are many sizes of even chicken eggs, and we have to determine, and there is a machlokes Amoraim exactly what is that shiur. This is going to link us already into the next Masechta Sukkah. We're going to be learning about, we're going to be reviewing Mishnayos that we have in Sukkah regarding what may and what may not be eaten outside of a sukkah. We're going to have the shita of Rava that fruit, no matter in what quantity, is allowed to be eaten outside the sukkah, does not require one to eat in the sukkah. And then as we'll transition into Daf Pei, we're going to go into the very big machlokes regarding Tumas Eicholin. There is a minimum shiur as to how much impure food is able to impart, to transmit tuma, and that is the shiur of the kibetza. And as just always reviewing, that Shitas Rashi, who is the Machmir, holds that whenever we Chazal speak about the shiur regarding tumas eicholin, it's only litame for it to impart tuma, for it to convey tuma, but to acquire tuma, even the minimum amount of food could acquire tuma under the right conditions. Shitas Tosfos and other Rishonim is that the shiur of tumas eicholin isn't only litame, but it's also litame. It's also that without the minimum amount of a kibetza, then foodstuff will not acquire tuma as well. And chevra, a lot more. Let us start again on Daf Ayin Ches Amud Beis. We are on the first wide line, right towards the last fourth of the Amid. The Mishnah, the Gemara is referring back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that both Hamelech and Akala, as will be defined, they are the exception to the rule. Rechitza is asur. Rechitza, washing, doesn't only mean the entire body, but as we learned explicitly, even a limb of the body. But they are from the few exceptions that indeed Yirchatzu es Paneim, they are allowed to wash their faces. And the Gemara points out that this is actually subject to a machlokes Tanoim, says the Gemara Masnisin Mani, who is the author of our Mishnah. It's only Rabbi Hananya ben Teradyoni and not the Chachamim, the Tanya. And the Braisa begins with the Tanach, or which is Shitas Chachamim, that Hamelech veHakala lo yirchatzu es paneim. They're not an exception. However, Rabbi Hananya ben Teradyon Omer, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, that both the king and the Kala yirchatzu es paneim. Furthermore, another machlokes Tanoim, again the Chachamim hold that Hechoya, a woman, a new mother who gave birth, loisinoy lesa sandal, she may not wear leather shoes. She's not an exception. And again, Rabbi Hananya ben Teradyon Omer, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, that Hechoya, a woman who just gave birth, a new mother, yes, tinoil es a sandal, she is allowed to wear leather shoes at kan de braisa, just to point out that what we learned in the Mishnah is subject to a machlokes Tanoim. We're up to the Aleph of the Bach. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shachal nimudvari. Okay, says the Gemara, let's begin. My tamon, why would Rab Hananya ben Teradion give an exception to the king? Melech, mishum dechsiv, melech biyafiyoi techezeno einechom, that your eyes will behold the king in his splendor. So there is an inyan for the king to appear with majesty, with royalty, and that includes for him to have a fresh and washed face. Kala, why is she an exception? Again, according to Rabbi Hananya ben Teradion, Kedei shelo tizgana al bala, for her not to become repulsive to her husband. Now, what about when she's not a Kala? So as we spoke out, as the Gemara will define right now, that the halacha of a Kala extends for 30 days. And Chazal expect of us that once a man is married for 30 days or more, that when he looks at his wife, he should not be seeing her chitzonius, he should see at least also her pnimius, and she'll never be tizgana al baila. This is only needed when they're not yet connected. And Amalei Rav to Rab Chia, Kala at Kama. Until when do we extend the status of a Kala? Amalei Kidatanya, and this is a Mishnah that we have in the beginning of Masechta Ksubas. Here we're speaking about of a tragedy that happens until today. That there are times that on the day of the chuppah, a parent of the chassan or the kala passes away. And that whole sugya of once the meal is already prepared, don't forget that in those days, they would prepare the meal on the day of the wedding, there was no refrigeration. If you were to delay the wedding, you would lose all of that food. So do you do the wedding even though the kala, in the case over there in Ksubas, is in a state of mourning? And the Mishnah says that ein moinim tachshitin min hakala, in such a scenario, even though she's in mourning, and normally people in mourning limit or don't adorn themselves, they don't put on makeup, but here we don't withhold it from her, and there the Mishnah writes clearly, kol shloishim yom. So that's the source that the halacha of a kala goes for 30 days. Weiter, second to last line. Again, the machlokes tanoim, but we are quoting the sheet of Rabbi Hanani ben Teradion that hechoya is allowed to put on leather shoes, a woman, a new mother, tina lasra sandal. And why is that? Mishum tzinam. Because cold will be harmful to her. And therefore, Amar Shmuel, that this exception isn't only for a new mother, it's just an example. Diber hakosuf boheva, so to say. That imachmas sakonas akrav, he gives an example. That if there's a fear that you have certain venomous creatures, you have a scorpion that's hanging around, and people are wearing shoes also to prevent themselves from being bitten, that's also a prevention of a sakana. Then mutar, meaning then everyone is allowed to wear leather shoes. Again, obviously nowadays, that the types of shoes that we have can fully protect us, like leather, from a bite of a scorpion, then we're not allowed to wear leather shoes. They were speaking about it at times that this was the only alternative that served for your protection. Okay, and as we mentioned in the intro, this is a very unusual machlokes. We're going to ultimately have a machlokes as to what is the shiur of a kiseva sagasa. We're not going to be speaking about ounces. We're going to be just using the words of the Chazal. Very importantly, by shiurim, we're speaking about the volume. We're not speaking about the weight. And the Mishnah says that if a person eats on Yom Kippur the amount of food in the volume of a koiseves hagasa, of a large date, that is when they're going to be chayiv kares. Again, to reiterate, and if a person ate less than that, less than the shiurim, so then they're not breaking their inoi. They are certainly violating an isur derabanan, which was without doubt. But by the way, that's the whole source about the concept of shiurim, that when a person feels that they have to break the fast on Yom Kippur, we at least advocate that initially try at least not to break the fast biblically, and that's by eating less than this year. Boye Rav Papa. And this is a classical, nuanced inquiry. That what exactly is the amount of this date? Is it bigari nasa? Is it with the pit? Or is it beloy gari nasa without the pit? Now, we're going to read Rashi, and then we're going to have to explain Rashi. So the top Rashi writes, what do you mean that Rav Papa is asking with the pit or without the pit? Go back to the Mishnah. Doesn't the Mishnah write explicitly, and it does, with the pit? So says Rashi, the Mishnah writes, v'chagari inasa. Nevertheless, mi boyelei, the boya of Rav Papa is, heichi ka'amar. What is the meaning of the pit? Is it komoyu v'chagarinasa yacha? Doesn't mean like the date with the pit inside of it. Right, Rashi, with it, but with the pit outside of it. Now, the Meroi Meisad explains Gavaldik. When you have a pit in a date, aside of the volume of the date, of the meat, and the pit, there is also the hollow or some air space in between one and the other. And if it means with the pit inside of it, then you have to have that additional amount of space equals volume to be chayiv kares. That's a leniency. If it's going to be without the pit, the way Rashi says, not without the pit, with the date and the pit on the side, then it's only going to be the shiur of the meat of the date, the shiur of the volume of the pit, without the hollow. It's going to end up being a little bit smaller. That's the boya. Now, boya Ravashi had a similar boya. The Gemara is going to make a point with this. You know, once these Amoraim got into this nuance, by the very fact that Ravashi did not inquire like Rav Papa, as we'll see in a moment, and the fact that Rav Papa did not inquire like Ravashi, that's because each one knew the answer for the other, and we will follow their answer. Now, what was Ravashi's boya? Me'ingen le'ingen. By tumas meis, a bone, a human bone, and this is both from a yid and lahavdil ananyid, that it conveys tuma b'maga ubamasa, even only in the size of a kisa'oira, of a barley. So the question is, when we have this halacha l'meishmi Sinai, that if it's only in that amount, it conveys tuma, is it be'etzem kisa'oira, when the sa'oid is in its shell? Yeah, you can just imagine how thin the shell is, but does it have to be that amount? Or even less? Or even likely pasa? Ravashi had another inquiry. Is it belacha? Is it a fresh barley kernel? Fresh is a little bit larger, it's a little bit more swollen, or biyabash, biyavesh, I'm sorry, or even when it's dry. Now the point of the Gemara is that once you have Ravashi asking this nuance, and the difference will be mamasha kechuta sa'ara. Why didn't Ravashi ask Rav Papa's question regarding our halachas? Because he didn't have a question. So Ravashi lemiboyelei Rav Papa. You know why? Because he inferred the answer from our Mishnah. Because since the Mishnah said Gasa itmar, Gasa implies the largest date with a pit. Kol kama de gas. Yes, it's the pit inside of it. You have to include the hollow space in between the pit and the meat of the date to come to the minimum sure to be chayiv kares, and that's why we will paskin like it. Similarly, Rav Papa did not ask the question b'negei tumas meis like as Ravashi did. That's because he understood that when the barley is lacha, it's not called so'ira, it's called shiboilis. When the barley is without its klipa, it's also not called keso'ira, it's called a ushla mikri. So therefore, it must be that this halacha l'meishim Sinai, that how much of an etzem could convey tuma by masa, by maga and masa, it must be dry and in its shell. And again, since Rav Papa knew that, we will follow, so to say, we would follow the clarity of Rav Papa. And now we begin, like we mentioned, the one machlokes we're going to have on Daf Ayin Tes. It's going to extend between, on one side, Rav Yehuda. There's a machlokes whether it's Rava in the name of Rav Yehuda, whether it's a Rabba in the name of Rav Yehuda. So we'll just say Rav Yehuda, and on the other side of this machlokes will be Rav Zavid. So let's begin. You should know that in volume it's larger than the egg. We always speak about the egg of a tarnagolis, a hen's egg. So we know the shiur of a kezayis. Kezayis will be the smallest. The question will be, is the koiseva sagasa in between the kezayis and the kebetza? And Rabbi Yehuda says no. It's a kezayis, larger than that is a kebetza, and larger than that is the koiseva sagas. Okay, that's number one. Number two, how did we get to that shiur? Don't we have a rule that whenever God speaks about eating, it's referring to a kezayis? And the answer is, that the baracha miyasvadate, as we'll see again on Daf Pei, since the Torah doesn't write, don't eat, right? The Torah writes that ta'anas nafshei seichem. In other words, when are we violating God's mitzvah? When we are not in a state of affliction, how much food does one need to eat to go from a state of affliction or of hunger into a state of yishuv hadas, or in Aramish, miyasvadate, that's the shiur. But basar ma'achi, if you eat less than this koiseva sagasa, le miyasvadate. Okay, Meisvei, on this statement of Rav Yehuda, that koiseva sagasa is larger than an egg. Now, Chevra, again, we're going to go next, the next Masechta Sukkah, on the Seder that we're learning. There we're speaking about both types of foods and the quantities of them that are allowed to be eaten outside the sukkah, versus those types and or quantities that, this must be eaten only in a sukkah. Another din of sukkah that we know is that you have the etzem hadin, and then you have people that are machmer. And these chumras are written in the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, they will happen once on Sukkos. They brought for him only to taste a cooked dish. That's called an achilas arai. He wasn't having a proper meal. And as we'll see, he would have been allowed to eat it outside the sukkah, but he was machmer. Similarly, they brought to Rabban Gamliel 2 dates, not food in the size of, 2 dates, and a bucket of water. And here also, the Tanakama, these Tanoim held that Me'ikar Adin, they are allowed to eat it outside the sukkah. They didn't. They were machmir. But both of them, V'amru, the Hasidim said, we remember, we saw that happening, that our Rebbes, Ha'elum L'sukkah, they brought it up. It was common. People had sukkahs on their roof, whatever it is. They went and they dafka ate it in the sukkah. Now the Braisa clarifies on this Mishnah to make it clear that the reason why they brought it up to the roof, the point of the Mishnah is Lo mipnei halacha kach. No, Alpi halacha, as we'll clarify more in Amud Beis, that food does not need to be eaten in the sukkah. But elo sheratzu lahachmer al atzman. However, now we're going away from the Braisa, we're going back into the Mishnah. Another story with yet another Tana. The food was not a tafshel, wasn't a cooked dish, it wasn't fruits. Oichel here, my friends, means bread. So here we're speaking about a food type that for sure has to be eaten in a sukkah, but less than the amount of a kibetza. Now, there is a machlokes, as we'll see today on Amud Beis, between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. How much food do you need to have that demands of you to do netilas yadayim, to join us, to do birchas hamazon? We're going to connect these things together, even though they're not exactly connected in halacha. But the topic of what's the minimum amount of bread that defines this as a meal. Rabbi Yehuda is the one that holds that it has to be in the amount of a kibetza or more, and he does not subscribe to the lesser shiur of a kazayis. And obviously, as we will see, Rab Tzadok subscribes to the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. So now we're not speaking about brachas now, but it's connected. They brought to him oichel bread less than a kibetza. And here the issue is, he put everything together, Rab Tzadok. If it's less than a kibetza, since he follows the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda, therefore he holds that you do not require a sukkah, you don't require al netilas yadayim, you don't require birchas hamazon. Rab Tzadok put it all together. Eloma, he, being that he's not mechuyev to wash his hands, now we're speaking just begashmias, his hands were a little bit dirty, so natlu b'mapa, he took it in a cloth, only for cleanliness. But since he held you don't have to wash your hands for the mitzvah, and va'achlei chutz l'sucha, and v'loi beirach achrav. In other words, ke'ilu, that the first 2 Tanoim, they were machmer, Rab Tzadok wasn't machmer. Since it was less than the shiur, so therefore, sukkah, you don't have to eat it in the sukkah. Other din, connected, no netilas yadayim. Okay, so he held it with a mappa. Okay, guys, don't confuse this with the halachas that we learned in brachas, that if a person has to wash netilas yadayim, but they don't have access to water, that at a certain time, in certain scenarios where there is no water, then one of the solutions is to hold it through a mappa. That's not the case over here. It's pashut for cleanliness, and also he did not make a bracha achrayna. Now listen to the link that we're going to make in the Gemara Daf Ayin Tes Amud Beis. What does that imply? First of all, says the Gemara, that had the shiur of the bread. Now we're comparing the bread and the dates, and the Gemara is going to later entangle this raya because of it. But first, let's just focus that if the amount of bread would have been in the size of a beitzah, then he would have needed a sukkah. So from which we will deduce that the meal of the 2 dates, let's go back to the 3 Tanoim. What did they bring to Rabban Gamliel? Not bread, I know that, but let's not differentiate between the type of food. We're just going to focus on the shiur. It must be that the meal of the 2 dates were smaller than 1 egg. Why? Because since the Braisa made it clear that even though he ate it in the sukkah, but it was a chumrah, and we see that by bread, the shiur of a kibetza would have demanded the Rab Tzaddik to eat it in the sukkah. So the presumption of the raya is that if the 2 dates would have been in the size of a kibetza, then Rabban Gamliel would be mechuyev to have it in the sukkah and not just to be machmer. It's only about value. Even though, again, the Gemara is going to say later, what are you talking about? This is dates and this is bread. Fine. Now, don't forget that we are speaking by Yom Kippur about a date and the pit. But here again, another very interesting Metzias premise. The Havamina is that the pit of the date is less than the meat of the date. So 2 dates is for sure a date and its pit, because it's the meat of 2 dates. And l'choira, together it's less than an egg. It's how can you, either Rava or Rabba, in the name of Yehuda, say, Yechap Chevre, that the Kekoiseves Hagasa with the pit is larger than a Beitza. 2 pits, even with two dates, even without the pits together, are not the size of a kibetza. Is like you, Rav Yehuda saying, B'Shem Rav Yehuda, is you say to me kibetza. So hashta, I know that in Sukkah you can argue we're speaking about pitted dates without pits. So what? Shtei koiseves, beloy garinim, must be, again, it must be because if it would have the amount of a kibetza, then he would have to eat it in the Sukkah. Well, they have a kibetza. So koiseves, hagasa, v'chagar inosa. Mi hava yesere mi kibetza, again, based on the premise that the pit itself is less than the volume of the meat. Many things can be challenged, as the Gemara will challenge. Okay, so that's a kasha on Rav Yehuda, answers the Gemara, Amar Rav Yirmiyah. Let me challenge one premise, and there's no kasha. In 2 dates without their pits together, I'll accept your premise. Did not amount to the volume of an egg. Because if 2 dates would have amounted to the volume of a beitza, even though it was fruit, but he's accepting this analogy that just like by bread in the shiur of a kibetza, you're mechuyev to have it in the sukkah, the same thing would be with other foodstuffs, or maybe dafka with dates. And guys, how many times did we learn, just to know, about the tremendous nourishment of dates? Where did we just learn recently? I think it was even in Yoma. Maybe it was in the prior Masechta that dates are people lived off dates. All you need is to eat dates. Make a date diet. However, koiseves hagasa v'chagar inosa, if there's the pit is more voluminous, if that's the English word, than the meat. The pit of the date has more volume than the meat. That's approach number 1. And indeed, that's going to be authenticated, as well as the Metzias in Bavel, that Omar Rav Papa, Hainu da Amri Inshi, that if you gather 2 kavim of dates, 2 kavs of dates, you know how much pits you'll have? You'll have a kav and a bit. In other words, there's more pit than the date. Kav kaba the kashiyasa usiriach. There's going to be 1 kav of pits and some extra. I just want to point out, and we have here a doctor with us just to authenticate this, that I think pits of apples are poisonous. That's what I was told. Don't worry, it's only if you eat a lot of them. But the pits of dates, that if you can grind them up, they have more nutritional value than the date themselves. That just maybe that's why God made it in a way that there's more pit than meat, because it's very healthy. And if I'm wrong, I stand corrected. We were speaking here about the volume. Okay, that's number 1. Rava says you don't have to go there. Rava is not debating this Metzias. All Rava is saying is, just because you correctly inferred from Reb Tzaddik that if he would have had bread in the amount of a kibetza, following Shitas Rebbe Yehuda, that the size of Birchas Hamazon and Brachas, fine, that's by bread. What are you hacking with fruit? Rava Amar, Hasamaynu Taimam. You know why Rabban Gamliel, the Braisa says, was only machmer, which means that he didn't have to, al pi ikar adin. I'm going to argue that Bechlal Rav Yehuda is right. 1 date with a pit is more than a kibetza. 2 dates are much more than a kibetza. Hasam hainu tama mishum dahava peira. Yeah, he was eating fruits. And you know what? Forget about the amount of a kibetza. No matter how much fruit you eat, according to Rava, upeira loy boya sukkah. When boya sukkah, l'kula alma, when you're having bread, according to many, when you're having mezoinas, products that come from the chameshes aminim, not by fruit. So we're going to get off on that right now. So now, based on the fact that Rav is saying that Peira Loboy Yasuka, we're going to challenge that. Meisvei, Frekti Gemara, it says in the Braisa that Omer Rebbe, Kishayinu Loimdim Torah Eitzel Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, the Tana. Heviu Lefaneinu, they brought in front of us Teinim, figs, and Va'anavim, and grapes. And this is on Sukkos, and Va'achalnum, Achilas Arai. We ate. Achilas aray means that the quantity, halachically, constituted only a snack. This has to do with amounts. We're not speaking about the type of food because they brought for them fruit. That we ate achilas aray chutz l'sukkah. What does that imply? That the only reason why they were allowed to eat it chutz l'sukkah is because the quantity was only enough for it to be defined as a snack and not as a meal. Says the Gemara, in other words, achilas aray in, achilas kevaloi. That seemingly is implying against Rava's statement that upeira, period, never needs a sukkah. Answers the Gemara, no. Ema, you have to reword it or re-understand it, that achalnum ki achilas aray. Since they only brought in front of us figs and grapes, in other words, fruits, so it automatically has a din of an achilas aray, no matter how much we will eat, and therefore we ate it outside the sukkah. I know they were not machmer. Now, another just nuance, that why does he write Kishahayinu loimdim Torah? You can learn from over here that they also would have been machmer. Eloma, since they were middle of learning Torah, and Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua was teaching, if they would have to leave to go eat it in the sukkah to be machmer, then they would lose the shiur. That's another implication. So that's why they decided they needed to eat it, so they ate it chutz l'sukkah, because al pi ikar adin, you don't have to eat that in the sukkah. Or, ibo yasema, going back to this apparent contradiction, that achalnu machilas keva. Chiddush there was, no, the fruits, like Rava, they ate a large amount. And that does not demand the sukkah, because Rava is right, peira loy bo'u sukkah. There was another chiddush there, that v'achalnu pas achilas aray behadayu. They didn't only eat fruit; they ate now a small amount of bread. And here you would have thought that even though the bread, the quantity per se was only en achilas aray, but they weren't only eating bread; they were eating bread with fruit. Maybe together, it's machshiv the bread into achilas kavam. That was the point of the Braisa. Yet they ate it outside the sukkah because al pi ikar adin, it didn't qualify yet for you to be mechuyev to eat that in the sukkah. Okay. Now, leima misayele, that what? That fruit never has to be eaten in the sukkah, because here now we're quoting a chazal still in Masechta Sukkah. There, Chevra, we're going to learn that the Tana Rabbi Eliezer holds that over the Yom Tov of Sukkot, you remember this, you have to have 14 meals. We'll leave the nuances. What about Shabbos? You have to have 3 meals, and then what about Friday? You have to have 14 meals over the 7 days of Sukkot. So says the Gemara that lefikach im hishlim b'minei targima, that if you are going to add up the 14 meals, there was a meal that you only ate of targima. Now the havamina here is that the targima means meat or fish. That's the havamina, not fruit. That if you had that's more chashuv than fruit. Even if you had a su'uda only of meat and fish, hishli means with bread, but it was a very small amount of bread. But these are foods that are lochoyda. That's the having eaten with bread. You're going to be yotza. You can count this as one of the 14 meals. Now, the isal kadaitoch, that even when a person only eats peira, if he eats in a large amount, if he's koiveya sudan peira, he's muchoyev to eat in the sukkah. So we should have said a greater chiddush. We should have said that you can be mashlim the 14 su'udas even only with peira. The fact that the minimum was targima, adarab is a raya that peira is never considered a su'udah, and that's a proof that Rav is right. If it's not considered a su'udah, then peda, no matter how much you can eat chutz l'sukkah. The Gemara says that's not a proof. We're not refuting Rav, we're just saying it's not a proof, because my mine targima, how do you know how to teach targima? Targima means pedas. Ve'iba yisema. Really, the lefikach could have been that im hishlim bepeda, then your yoitza, the 14 meals. Not every location had access to fruit, which is considered a shtick of luxury. So therefore, again, they spoke about the Metzias, but mean they targimu. Okay, Atkan, Rava or Rabba b'shem Rav Yehuda, that the shiur of Kesevas Hagasa with the garden, like Rav Ashi understood, with the airspace in between the pit and the meat, is larger than the shiur of a kibetza. However, Rab Zvid Amar, and as you can see over here, that the shita of Rab Zvid is the shita that's accepted in halacha, both in Rambam and in Tur and in Shulchan Aruch, that koiseves hagasa sha'amru, the large date, mit the pit, mit the airspace, all of that is chaseira mikabetza. It's smaller than an egg. And here, Rab Zvid is going to authenticate, he's going to bring a raya to Shita. Ditnan, and Chevra, this is the first Mishnah in Masechtas Beitzah. Says the Mishnah, Bei Shammai Yoimrim. So here we're speaking not about the Isur of eating on Pesach. Here we're speaking about the Isur of possessing chametz on Pesach. What's interesting is, as we learned not long ago, Masechtas Pesachim, that when the Torah is speaking about the lav of Bal Yira, Bal Yematzah, the Torah sometimes speaks about don't possess so'ir. So'ir is yeast. So'ir is not just chametz, but it's a chametz that has the koyach to be machmet something else. No, it's leaven that if you put this in another dough, it's going to make the other dough rise a lot quicker. Right? Toifeyach al manas lahatfiach in the negative. Then you have stam chametz. Chametz is, bread. It's chametz, but it doesn't have the power to be machmet something else. The Torah, when the Torah speaks about the prohibition of owning, possessing chametz, the Torah sometimes says don't possess ha'oir, other times the Torah says don't possess chametz. Says Beis Shammai that when are you going to be violating the ownership, the possession of, in the amount that you'll be chayiv, a punishment by so'ir kezayis. By chametz, which is weaker, for you to be violating the shiur, it has to be in the larger amount of a koiseves. Shitas Beis Shammai. And the Havinen Ba over there in Beitzah a bit later, in Daf Zayin, we are going to ask, my Tama de Beis Shammai, what's the logic behind Beis Shammai? Why doesn't he give a uniform shiur? And Beis Shammai, the Gemara explains the reason for Beis Shammai, because Nichtoi v'rachmana chametz. Whenever the Torah speaks about Bal Yira, Bal Yematzah, the only word the Torah should have used theoretically is chametz. And the Torah never needed to mention that we may not possess so'ir, and we would have known on our own. Va'ano amina uma chametz. The difference between so'ir and chametz is exactly like we mentioned, is that so'ir, in English it's called leaven, or it means an item, a chametz, that has the koyach to be machmetz, right? Toifeyach al manas latviach. Ma chametz she'ein chimutzei kasha. It doesn't have the power to instigate to something else to become leavened. And nevertheless, asur b'kezayis, so I would know that so'ir, not only is it chametzdik, but it has the power to be machmetz, shechimutzei kasha is like kol shchein. Yet, says the Gemara explaining by Shammai, that mi de palginu rachmana, since the Torah distinguishes the chametz from the so'ir, how does the Torah distinguish it, separate it, differentiate it? By mentioning both. Lim dalacha, to tell you, I'm telling you both because it's a different shiur. They're both prohibited. You may not possess A, you may not possess B, but it's different. Shiur shel zeh, like shiur shel zeh. And what's their conclusion? The first white line, that the isur of possessing so'ir, the punishment, the isur is only b'kezayis, and v'chametz is b'kekoiseves. Now comes Rab Zvid, and he says, beautiful. If Rav Yehuda would have been right, and the shiur of a keseves hagasa is yiseira mikebeitzah, all Beis Shammai is looking for is to find a larger shiur than the kezayis. And no, we're not making up new shiurim. So we have b'chlal throughout the Torah. We have the shiur of a kezayis, we have a shiur of a kebetza, we have a shiur of a keseves. Whether it's placed before or after, that's the machlokes over here. Take it one notch up. According to Rav Yehuda, what is the next standard shiur in the Torah? Greater, larger than a kezayis, a kebetza. So why didn't they say, he's looking for a shiur that's larger than the kezayis? Taka, since chametz is ein chimutzei kasha, so you have to own more for you to be violating with a penalty the issur of possessing of chametz. So litni kebetza. So that's proof number one. And furthermore, even if you're going to counter by telling me even if they are the same, then the third line in the wide lines, nitni kebetza. Like Rashi writes that the shiur of kebetza, I'm reading inside the Rashi, shuhu shagur b'mishnah yoiser mikikoiseves le'inyan tumas eichalin. Since in Mishnayos, where particularly in tumas eichalin, where there the shiur is not a kezayis, as we'll learn soon, the shiur is of a kebetza, people are familiar with the shiur of a kebetza. If you're going to hack that kezayis and kebetza is the same, then the Mishnah should use that which is more familiar for those who learn Mishnayos. It's not the same shiur. And all we need is something that's one notch above the kezayis, and that's the koisevis. That is the elalav shmamina. That koisevis is pechusa mikezayis. That's the proof of Rab Zvid, which this forms a kasha on Rav Yehuda, and that's why the Gemara has to refute the proof. In other words, we're not going to refute Rab Zeda, but we're going to fadenfer, we're going to explain the Amoira Rav Yehuda. Says the Gemara, nisht, mimai, dilma, lo oilam eimelach, I'll tell you that koiseves hagasa, our Mishnah Yom Kippur uses the large date, is larger than the egg. Over there in Mesechtas Beitza, when Beis Shammai said that chametz bekik koiseves, Beis Shammai didn't say gasa. He's speaking about an average size date, and that is the stain. Hastama is equal. We read that Rashi, it's more shagur the lashon kebetza. That's not a problem. Sometimes the Chazal can use the word kebetza, and other times they can use the word koiseves. Hastama kebetza ve'i nami kadadininu meilachada binayu nakat. Take out the vav. Very good. So therefore, this is Bachlal Nanarayit Rab Zvid, and now we're going to have another attempted proof. Another attempted proof that even the large date is smaller than the egg. Beautiful. In Torah, we don't care about the Metzias, we're looking at what the Torah says. Okay. Now we're going back to Masechta Brachos, and we mentioned this on Amud Aleph when it comes to the shiurim. So the way the Mishnah words the question of how much bread is at kama mizamnin, which means literally how much bread do I eat for you to tell me that I'm obligated to join a zimun. We're not speaking about me making up the zimun. There's a zimun going on, which means you have already 3 people or more that are benching, and therefore the benching has to be led by someone. And prior to the benching, he's going to say, Rabbi Saimel and benching, they're going to be holding a koshel bracha. And I'm also in around there. How much bread must I eat for me to be obligated to join the zimun? Now, really, just to get it clear, as we learned in brachas, the Mishnah could have asked, how much bread do you need to eat for you to be obligated to say Birchas Hamazon? One is connected to the other. No, it's the moment I ate enough for me to be mechuyev to bench Birchas Hamazon, that will be the shiur that will be mechayev me to join a zimun. But the focus here is how much do you have to eat to be obligated to join a zimun? So here's the machlokes. That the Rav Meir holds at kezayis. David Rav Meir. Rabbi Yehuda holds at kebetza. Less than the kebetza. And kebetza is for sure larger than the kezayis. Then really you're not mechuyev to bench, and therefore you're not mechuyev to join the zimun. Now the Gemara says, what's underlying this machlokes? B'mai komifligi Rav Meir savar, the pasuk that we have v'achalta v'savata uveirachta is very important. Rav Meir holds that when the Torah says v'achalta, it means eating, and therefore we have a klal, my friends. The rule is whenever the Torah mentions the words eating means a kazayas. Doesn't it say eat and be satisfied and bench, which would imply that if you're not satisfied, you're not mechuyev biblically to bench? No, satisfied is another din. V'savata zu shasiya. Guys, there's a huge machlokes rishonim how to learn this. Let's just quote one approach. V'savata zu shesiya means that if a person ate a kazayas and they're thirsty, if they did not drink, then biblically they don't have to bench. Other rishonim learn that if you only drink, you're mechoyev to bench. That's not the way we're going to learn over here. No, it's don't link the v'savata to the ve'ochalta. Ve'ochalta uve'rachta. The only addition is that you also need to drink if you're benching and you're thirsty, even though you ate the kazayis, midoyanaisa, you're exempt from benching. That's all that I've made. The point is that v'savata is a separate din. So as far as how much do I need to eat to bench, the Torah says, achalta. And there's the rule. Every time God says eat, whether it is in the positive or normally don't eat something, don't eat treif, achila is kazayis. And b'achila b'kazayis, that's the reason why Rav Meir holds, if you ate a kazayis, you're mechoyev to bench. But Rabbi Yehuda savar, no. V'achalta v'savata, and only then do you have to bench. Achila sheyesh b'asaviyah. How much do you need to eat to be satisfied? That's a kebetza. Now, I want to take a step back. The real truth is that many understand this entire machlokes only on a asmachta level. Many understand that really everyone understands that mi'ikar adin midayrai, so you have to be satisfied, and there is no shiur for that. Some people will get satisfied by eating a larger amount, some people a smaller amount. All of this is why did the Chachamim say that even if you're not really v'savata, that's the way we learn, you have to bench. That's the whole vart that we have, that it says Yisa Hashem panav elecha, where we learned this together a few times already, that Hashem is going to show us favoritism. It says that Hashem lo Yisa, Hashem doesn't show favoritism, and God answered. He told the Malachim, yeah, I don't show favoritism, but I told the Yidden, eat and be satisfied and bench. They went ahead and they bench even if they only ate a kazayas or even a kebetza. That's this machlokes. How can I not show them favoritism? And the way Hasidus explains what pshat is that sometimes a lot of good has to be done for it to get noticed. And if we don't have that large amount of good, then if God will notice even something little, that's called showing favoritism. But when we eat, same thing. Normally you feel satisfied, you bless God. Once we get into the habit of eating only a little bit, and we thank God for the little that God gave us, then mida keneged mida, not me favoritism. God looks at the little we do little. We don't do enough, we should do more. Then God looks at our little and also gives us a bracha. That's the pshat, that there's no favoritism. So I'm just pointing out that all of this is only an asmachta, but none of this is really going to get to our flow. The point is like this. Again, Rab Zvid holds that a koiseves hagasa is less than a kebetza. So says the Gemara 3 lines from the bottom, the is al kadaitach. Like Rav Yehuda, that koiseves hagasa she'amru, he said in kebetza. And don't forget, how did he get to that shiur? How did we begin today's shiur? That by Yom Kippur, it's about inui. Inui means that you're only breaking God's rule if you're not afflicted. If we have over here that even a kebetza is savuye mazba'a, makes a person feel satisfied, satisfaction is after you put to ease. You're starving, you're afflicted. The next madrega is you ate enough, now at least you're at ease. And then you eat more and you feel satisfied. If eating a kebetza brings satisfaction, then for sure, daito lo miyasvam, then for sure you have Yishuv Adas. It must be, this is beautiful, that the Kesevas Hagasa is less than the Kebetza, then it fits. So there's hunger. A Kazais does not take away the hunger, but a Kesevas Hagasa doesn't make you satisfied. It takes away the Yishuv Hadas, and then the Kebetza. El Olaf Shmamino, Kesevas Hagasa Sha'amru is Taka Pachus Mi Kebetza. And Kebetza, Masba'a, when you have the larger amount, which is the egg, then you actually feel satisfied. But if you only have kekoi then you can't say you're satisfied, but at least you hit the first line, which on Yom Kippur is a negative. Which is why you'll be chayiv kares for eating on Yom Kippur unless there was a need. Okay, so that's something that not only the Gemara doesn't refute, but this, you can argue, is really going to be a kasha against Rav Yehuda. The Gemara doesn't try to fight for Rav Yehuda. Maybe that's one of the reasons in Klalei Halshas why, like we mentioned, you can see there's the base from the Amish but not a mitzvah that we paskin we paskin like Rab Zavid, which is important. That means that kikoiseves hagasa, with the pit inside of it, is less than the shiur of the egg. Chavra, we have time, let's move on. Tanya. We just mentioned the shiur of a kebetza, and like Rashi says, it's shagur b'mishnah. How is it shagur? Because there's a lot of dinei tumas oicholin. Rebbe Yomer, Chavra Daf Pei, Kol hashiuram kulam. Whenever we learn about eating, and everything has a minimum amount for which one gets punished for violating, or a minimum amount to fulfill the mitzvah, like eating matzah. So the rule is bikazayis, and the big exception is chutz mitumas oicholin, when it comes to the halachos of food becoming or imparting, acquiring or transmitting. Again, Rashi holds that the shiurim of tumas oicholin, meaning that if there is less than the minimum amount, it doesn't have tuma, it only means it doesn't convey. Shitas Rashi. Acquiring any amount. Now there's so many other dinim. Not every food can acquire. It has to normally first be susceptible to becoming tamei. You have to know what madrega is the source tuma. We had this in the beginning of Psachim, whether chulin can only become a sheni. We had Rabbi Akiva that holds that chulin can even become a shlishi. That's not negeya at all. Just what is the minimum amount? So these are the words. That tumas eicholin, since sheshina hakasuv b'mashma'an, since the Torah altered, the Torah was meshana, it's mashma'os, because the Torah used different verbiage. Not the normal don't eat, as we'll see in a moment. From Parsha Shemini, we're speaking about the Torah writes Mikol ha'oichel asher yei achel. It could have just said Mikol ha'oichel. That's in the Parsha of Tuman Shemini. So since there is a change in verbiage, it's a change in implication, and therefore v'shinu chachamim b'shiyurim. L'shitas toisvis, not only do you need to have a kebetza to impart tuma, toisvis is more lenient. He holds that on a biblical level, for food to acquire tuma, you have to have the amount of a kebetza. If there's less than that amount, it won't even acquire tuma. And then there's so many nuances in that. Does it have to be connected? Being in the same keli, even if it's not touching, the keli is mitzarefet to the kebetza, v'chulei v'chulei. Okay, now, continues Rebbe, how do I know that when the Torah is mishana in its expression, we can extrapolate from that the shiur should be different? V'raya l'davar is from our din of Yom Kippur, that the Torah was mishana de lashon on Yom Kippur, and here we continue my shina hakasav b'mashma in Yom Kippur, because the Torah doesn't say thou shalt not eat. The Torah says that the Torah says that kikol hanefesh asher lo yisa'una be'etzam hayom hazeh v'nichrasa. Not b'chol hanefesh asher oichel. It's about affliction. And because of the Torah changing its verbiage and using the word affliction, therefore the Chachamim applied that what is affliction or what is miyasvadaitoi koiseves. So similarly, by Tumas Eicholin, since the Torah changes the way it words things, so the Chachamim therefore changes the shiur. Now the Gemara wants to understand, why do we need to bring any raya from Yom Kippur? In other words, forget about Yom Kippur. Whenever if the Torah changes its verbiage, it means something else. If you don't accept that premise, so then taka, why did the Chachamim even on Yom Kippur change to the shiur of a Kaiseves? Maraya l'davar Yom Kippur. Why do we need Yom Kippur? So the Gemara answers that the shinoi of the wording in the Torah by Tumas Eicholin is not as extreme, it's not as boilet as it is in Yom Kippur. Had the Torah only, if the Torah wouldn't have mentioned anything unusual by Yom Kippur, I get it, mikol ha'oichel asher yei achel, that we'll see in a few lines. Istaka is shinoi. It's not such a big shinoi. Don't forget, the Torah uses the words achila. Elamat's used to double. It's superfluous. The real shinoi is by Yom Kippur. The Torah B'chlal doesn't mention eating. But once the Torah sets a precedent that there is a shinoi, that's the way we're going to learn it. It blazed the trail. And the Chachamim interpret a shinoi haloshin to mean a shinoi in the shiur. So once we establish that, now even when there is a lesser shinoi in the lashon, which is by Tumas Eicholin, it also means a difference in the shiur. That The answer is the Gemara. Hi, Mahasam. I'm sorry. Right here, the dollar. Mahasam. The Mahasam. If we only would have found the shiur by Tumasei Chala and Avamina Urcha de Krau. Okay, it's superfluous. We would have learned something, but it wouldn't have meant a shinoi in the shiur. But by Yom Kippur, like we mentioned, it's a real bigger shinoi. And once we establish the klal, then even lesser shinuyim will have the same implication, which is huge, that the less than a kebetza, not less than a kazayis, is not going to be included l'kula alma in the shiur of li mitashva. Li mitashva is to impart, li mitachirik is to acquire. Now, tuma sechala mikabetza minalan meaning. What is the shinui of the lashon? Let's go weiter. Amar Ababo, Amar Abelazar, the Amar Kra, Pasuk in Shmini, Mikol Oichel Asher Yei Ochel. Okay, so now how do you make it ois superfluous? Tzadem is that what is the shiur? What are we going to use? A Oichel Habo Machmas Oichel. Food that comes on the account of a food. Food that comes from food. You know what that is? That's an egg that comes from a hen. Sai the second, the klesheni is food, and the source is also food. So what are you talking about? Every animal is born from the mom. The emagadi, a kid is born from the mother goat. The Gemara says no, because mechusar shchita. So everyone jumps and they say, what are you talking about? What about a chicken? What, you don't have to shech the hen? It means that if you shechted the hen and inside the hen you find an egg, there they are both edible, and that's something that's oichel, that's coming from oichel. And now the flow is good. So, Zoy, what about if you shech the animal and you find a baby inside of it, the ben pakua, the ema ben pakua? It's also oichel metoich oichel? No, it's not. It's not ready to eat. Because even though when you shech the mother animal, when there is a baby inside of it, with all of the pratim that we'll learn in Chulin, we don't have to chazer everything right now, then generally the baby doesn't have to be slaughtered, but ta'un kriya. The mother is not ready to be consumed. You have to rip it open to take out the blood and salting it, etc. Masha enkein by the egg. Well, there's only beitzas tarnagoyim. The ema beitzas bar yochani. Guys, we had this beitzas bar yochani. The Gemara says in Bechayres and Daf Nun Zayin is azah egg. It's such a large bird that once the egg cracked and the liquid of the egg submerged, made a flood in 60 cities. It's a guzma, but maybe it's a very large egg. So the Gemara says the rule tafasta meruba loy tafasta. Tafasta meuta tafasta. So look for the lesser one. So now the Gemara goes to the other side. What beitzas tarnagoyim is the tafasta muat ve'ema beyasa ditziparta. Why don't you have a beitza vatziparta? The zutar tuva. How do we get to beitzas tarnagoyim? We'll leave it by the cliffhanger. We'll stop over here, and we're going to clarify tomorrow. How do we know that kebeitza means kebeitzas tarnagoyim? Okay, very good. To be continued.